think the scariest thing about this story is that for the scary part, none of it was real, but it all really happened, and I lived through all of it, even, unfortunately, the scary parts. First, a little background. My father died a very sudden, sad, and controversial death. The last memory of him I have in which he was coherent was when I held his head in my lap with his blood on my hands. Myself, understandably hysterically waiting for the ambulance, and then full of rage 15 minutes later when it pulled up at a leisurely pace, no lights or sirens. Less than a week before, during a work lunch at Dairy Queen, I noticed my father was the color of yellow Crayola crayon. But when I noticed the color of his sclera matched his skin, I knew things were bad and I rushed him to the hospital. They told us that he had a tumor blocking his bile ducts in his liver, which explained the jaundice, but they didn't know if it was benign or what exactly caused it, and they would have to do further tests. After many angry phone calls on my part to his doctor, we got him rushed in for a PET scan, MRI, and a biopsy. Then, on the way home from an exhausting day, we pulled into the driveway and he went to get out of my car and his leg got caught. He spun, fell, and his head smacked down onto the pavement. Back to the hospital he went, and there he stayed because his new concussion didn't enable him to walk. This day reasonably traumatized me a bit, though I'm a bit embarrassed to say so. The next week was hell. For the record, we have about the worst hospital in the country, and I hope somebody buys it and burns that place to the ground. One day, my brother walked into my work at a retail store and demanded to speak to my manager. My pretty little head couldn't put two and two together. They gave my father less than a day to live, and about 12 hours later, their prediction rang true. However, I tell you this not to scare or draw sympathy, it's simply to set the stage for the scary. Another thing you should know is that I grew up being raised by my Hispanic mother, so Mexican culture was a large part of my childhood, but I'll get to that later. Anyway, the following weeks, I was a mess. I kept trying to force myself to grieve, to work through things and move on. I kept having nightmares of him coming back, still being alive, or coming back and revealing that it was all a big stunt. Obviously, I had issues I needed to work out, but in due time. I'm sure you've all heard many a scary urban myth, but maybe not the one of La Llorona, a woman named Maria, who, out of spite from her husband being unfaithful, drowned her children in a river, and with such force that she broke their little necks, making their deaths unnecessarily tragic, gruesome, and without reason. When she came to, she realized what she had done and ended her own life. Some say that it's because they wouldn't let her into the afterlife, or that it's purely out of guilt, but rumor has it that she wanders by the rivers and canals in Mexico, crying for her children, screaming out in self-inflicted agony. The spirit of a woman who went a little crazy, just like after the traumatic death of a parent. I guess you could say that I too went a little crazy. I'm sure the majority of you have heard the steps of grieving and all of the constant everyone grieves in their own way. It's all well and good, but what you might not have heard is a common thing to suffer from in the grieving process is a little thing called psychosis. One night very late at maybe 3 a.m., I had come home from watching Beyond the Boundary with a friend and was having an emotional night and wanted to be alone. I didn't want to be holed up in my room at my grandmother's, who I was staying with, so she wouldn't be alone. A poor mother who had lost her eldest child less than a week ago, and I would have to bury him in less than a month. I parked down at the bottom of the hill he lived on and got out, just wanting fresh air and to look at the stars. My first mistake was letting myself be alone, out in the dark. I walked, got fresh air, thought about all the work that was ahead of me, the huge mess my dad had just ditched me with, a grudge I still somewhat hold to this day. I got about 15 minutes of fresh night air and things went bad fast. I don't know what it was, if I maybe just got emotional, I don't remember, but suddenly I got a sinking feeling in my gut and my instincts screamed at me to turn and look. There, in the street lamp, she stood, decrepit and decaying. Her skin was the color of death and cold and wrinkled and sloughing off of her body from the looks of her. I knew it was her, but I also knew that La Llorona could not be standing down the street from me. We were probably a little less than a half a mile from a body of water, and about as far away from Mexico as you can get and still be in the US. It was early spring and my breath was still coming out in clouds, and of all things, I wondered why hers wasn't, but then I realized a corpse doesn't have to breathe. Besides, Maria had drowned herself. If anything, she'd probably just make a gurgling noise if she tried, and I prayed she didn't. I tried desperately to find a face. I could see the vague shape of a mouth, but no other features, and somehow my mind giving her no face made it worse. Her hands were bound. I don't know why, but maybe as punishment for what she had done. The hair covering her face was matted, wet, and scraggly, but the majority of it was covered with a white lace prayer veil. Something pretty standard for Mexico, but not seen so often in the US anymore. She wore a pretty plain Spanish-style white dress that thankfully covered the majority of her body, because as she started to move, I didn't want to see how her brittle, barely attached limbs moved. I tried to reason with my own mind. She can't be there. She's not real. I'm not a child. What would she want from me? But all rationalization stopped as for a split second I realized she was gone. And then back, but a good 3 feet closer. My breath hitched in my throat, and my first instinct was to make it back to my car. I was closer to it than my house at this point. I didn't want to turn my back on her. I knew she wasn't real, but I was so petrified that I couldn't bring myself to take my eyes off of her. As I backed up, my ankles felt funny, and looking down, I realized I was walking through, as silly as it sounds, phantasmal water. I only saw it in about a 6-inch radius around my feet, and as I looked, hers too. Why stay near the river when she could bring the river Styx with her? Quickly, I made it to my car. I unlocked it with the fob, and I got in. I sat there unsure what to do. She was still coming, teleporting a little bit at a time. My first thought was to call my mother, who had experience with this kind of thing, whereas my grandmother would have just committed me. I never took my eyes off of her, and the longer I stared, the more details I noticed. She was sopping wet, her hair and veil moving as one entity. You could see her legs through the dress, and one had a bit of some aquatic plant stuck to it. The binding around her was a dirty, water-damaged rope that had shredded her skin down to the bone. I wasn't even sure she could move her hands anymore. I tried to call my mom, but she isn't a night person, and she is a heavy sleeper. She wouldn't answer. I felt as if I could at least hear her voice. I could will myself to stop seeing this. To make it go away, La Llorona appeared about 10 feet away, and for the first time I could hear something, her wet dress squelching as it dragged across the asphalt. The low, somber weeping that didn't come from just her mouth, but her very being. I've always been grumpy towards my mom for not teaching me Spanish. I didn't know what to do. My instincts said drive, but where? I was home already, and I couldn't leave my grandmother alone in the apartment after everything we'd been through. That vanished, though, as suddenly the shambling, wet corpse of a spirit was in front of my car, almost touching the hood, and driving a tiny car. She was almost touching me. I finally saw her face, blue, withered, big, glowing white eyes. As I looked at them, I began to cry. I felt pain in them, even though this was my creation of my own grief-stricken mind. I felt like I could relate. The realization overcame me. I couldn't relate. I wasn't La Llorona. I wasn't a monster who had drowned her own children, who ended 3 lives just to spite a 4th. I was better than her. She had no right to be here. I had to reason to try and sympathize with this monster. Being my own hallucination, I guess she could read minds, because before I could react to her being so close, she raised her face to the moon and screamed. It wasn't loud, because it was in my head, but it was still one of the most blood-curdling, bone-chilling, and breath-stopping sounds I've ever heard. Something in me blazed to life, and I started the car and I floored it. She was gone. It wasn't like I hit her, but it was as if the moment my intention to drive through her became solid, she vanished. I drove a good distance to Walmart that night, where the parking lot was well lit, finally getting a hold of my mom, and I talked it out. After that, I did about 2 hours of window shopping. Then when the light started to come through the clouds again, I went home and I went to bed. I did see her again after that, but always in dark corners, far away. My brain had learned its place, so I tell you, never let anyone tell you how to grieve. but feel free to look up some unexpected side effects of the grieving process, because sometimes your feelings come to life as the monsters who haunt your dreams, so you can tell them off in person. I really hope this helps someone who might be going through a similar circumstance that I did.